And even Robert F. Kennedy Jr., RFK Jr., who's now the health minister in the US and with all his controversies, he even said, notwithstanding a generally anti-war, anti-imperial position that he carried, but he said, yeah, we desperately need Israel because it's our aircraft carrier in the Middle East. And without that, how are we going to make sure that we have access to all that oil and gas in the Middle East?
What if the key to dismantling Israeli apartheid lies not in the corridors of the United Nations or in the White House, but in the streets of Johannesburg? And what if South Africa, hailed for its miracle of liberation, also holds a warning that winning the vote doesn't mean winning the system? South African transition from apartheid to democracy is often celebrated, but behind the rainbow facade lies a deeper, unresolved story. One of economic betrayal, elite capture, and unfinished liberation. It's a story that resonates powerful with today's Palestine. This interview is not about sentimental comparison. It's about strategy. It's about what worked in South Africa, how global solidarity and the Boycott, Divest and Sanctions campaign fractured the economic foundations of white rule. And it's about what failed, how the ANC, upon seizing power, upheld the very neoliberal frameworks that suffocated justice. From debt repayment to fossil capital, South Africa became a cautionary tale of post colonial compromise. As the world watches Israel's escalating and renewed brutality, and as Western democracies entrench their complicity, this conversation asks, what can the Palestinians and their allies truly learn from the South African experience? What can be salvaged from that liberation movement and what should be discarded? My guest today is distinct Professor Patrick Bond. He's a scholar activist deeply embedded in both the struggle against apartheid and the international climate justice movement, and as such, he offers a rare clarity on these questions. With deep knowledge of power, protests, and betrayal, he maps out a theory of change rooted in the movements from below. So, this is not just an interview, it's a blueprint for resistance against apartheid in South Africa and in Palestine, and against the illusion that liberation can be negotiated with the very system that maintained its domination. But before we continue, let me just briefly mention that my Twitter account has been suspended. No big deal, I'm already building a community on Substack, a more or less decentralized platform where no social media oligarch can shut you down. So if you like my work, consider joining me there. The link's in the description. Professor Patrick Bond, what a pleasure having you. Good morning to you from the Netherlands to South Africa.
Oh, it's great to be here. We used to have Dutch visitors, I think, starting in 1652, but they weren't comrades like you are. So it's great that you're taking their space.
Patrick, I just saw on the little information that I collected about you, you were born in Belfast. So you have two particular point of views that I could imagine. One from the Belfast perspective and the other one from, so being a, how shall I say this, also a trouble spot on earth. And then, of course, from South Africa in terms of apartheid. Maybe you tell
Well,
us how you ventured from Belfast to South Africa.
yes, actually, some of my roots are on the Germanic side with some of the anti-Nazi fighters in the Grote Kapelle in Berlin. Uh, my teenager lives there now, and we always kind of going out to trace the steps of Haro Schulze and a great uncle and a great grandfather, Ferdinand Tönnies, who was a sociologist. But then on the British side, truly British, not Irish, a grandfather who was stationed in Burma where he was a colonial pig. You know, he was running a part of the Burmese state and for the Brits, and then he brought his new German wife, the daughter of Tönnies, there. And then after he was killed in World War II, lots of migration. My mum ended up in Northern Ireland, and my father on that side. The Bond family was part of a new petty bourgeoisie, getting degrees, recruited by the US military industrial complex, Werner von Braun's group, to work on the space program in Huntsville, Alabama, where I spent some formative years before going to university in the east coast of the US. And that was with economics teachers, some of whom were bourgeois, some Keynesian. And then gradually I found a Marxist economics program. I started in Swarthmore in Philadelphia, went to the Wharton School, about halfway between Donald Trump and Elon Musk. And so I learned all of the worst habits of financial capitalism. And then a doctorate with David Harvey at Johns Hopkins. And I moved to Southern Africa, Zimbabwe first, and then Johannesburg in 1990. And I don't think if I had to do it again, I would choose any other routing, because once you learn your politics, as I did in the 1980s anti-apartheid movement, working with Black community groups in US ghettos, working with the best of the labor movement, and especially the anti-apartheid movement and international solidarity, working at places like the Institute for Policy Studies, Pacifica Radio. All of those were the formative years. And then when you get trained in the South African struggle to serve in hopefully a useful way, I worked in Mandela's office doing his typing for the first policies in the new democratic government, and also with the civic movement, the urban social movements, and increasingly then with labor, especially the independent left labor movement and the environmental movement, where I learned much more about the climate catastrophe, where we're both in South Africa the victims and the villains. So that's a sort of broad range of, let's say, influences on me that allow me, sitting in Johannesburg, to enjoy watching the world and getting involved in all those sorts of struggles that we are, especially hosting the G20 this year, Thomas. Every struggle under the sun has to be on our radar screen. So we run a weekly G20 from below webinar, and we always invite you and your listeners, your viewers, to join us.
You will send me the link and I will provide the link down in the description for this interview. But two things. Did you just call one of your ancestors a colonial pig, number one? And number two, you were working with, also in the office of Nelson Mandela. That means, did you know him personally?
Yes, I mean, the first white paper, that is the policies, I drafted in his office, and had been working in the African National Congress and Congress of South African Trade Unions, South African Communist Party, and especially South African National Civic Organization. So in 1994, they came together with a reconstruction and development program. And really simply because I could type quickly and knew English, I was brought in to be the sort of crafter of some of the documents, the RDP and the RDP white paper, but I did quite a few others in other ministries. And at that time, Thomas, we really felt there was a liberatory possibility. And instead, we gradually, in fact, right in some respects from the outset, found that while Nelson Mandela had led a cause for freedom, one person, one vote in a unitary state, and with minor exceptions, there was no compromise there. It was a victory, an extraordinary historic victory that was due to the local protests, due to international solidarity. Nevertheless, we had one outcome that helps explain the way the struggle for, let's say, a boycott, divestment, sanctions position has to be really carefully understood. And the one dilemma was that corporates and the neoliberal ideologues of the international financial institutions and aid agencies, they actually achieved more rapidly dominance. And that was a tragedy for us, because the Freedom Charter in 1955 and the 1994 Reconstruction Development Program, even parts of the 1996 Constitution, were really negated by a neoliberal policy framework that worked not only in the Treasury and the Reserve Bank, but in virtually every other ministry. And that reminded me, there was a neo-colonial process in this country. And my own roots, partly from British colonial abuses, then led, after the changes that occurred in Burma. My grandfather killed there in 1942. But then,
The one that
after a
you just,
liberation movement led by
sorry, the, the one that you just called colonial pig, that's the one you mean?
my grandfather, and his role was not only to help manage large parts of the country, but to keep the Mandalay Road open until the end. He also managed some of the oil fields. And in all those ways, what we found was the contributions, let's say, to a post colonial opportunity were partly sabotaged by the residues, even after the British were kicked out of Burma by the Japanese. And the struggle for a free Burma, one that we have a small chapter here in Johannesburg to support, also takes some of the same lessons. And when I think about the ways that Nelson Mandela unfortunately succumbed on one of the most crucial questions, which was, should South Africa in 1994, when he was a president, should it repay the apartheid debt, reminded me in our discussions that we use the case of Aung San Suu Kyi, the great liberation leader from Burma, who said to the big banks, don't lend to the junta. And we could just imagine those big banks in 1994, 95 say, yeah, actually, we heard that before. We heard it from Nelson Mandela. And then Mandela decided to repay the loans that we made anyway. So, in a sense, although we won that freedom, the economic supplication to global finance was profound. And in my mind, it's still a tragedy, not only my family history in Burma, but also that in the struggle to get sanctions against the junta, that was a military junta. Now it's called Myanmar, and it's still the military junta killing its people. We desperately need sanctions. Europeans are probably most advanced, but we haven't been able to get them. And one reason is I think that we haven't had the sort of power to say that BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, such as worked very well in South Africa to weaken the white business community and break them away from the white political regime. But when you take power, as our neo-colonial African National Congress elites did, even Mandela, then they agreed to repay the apartheid debt. That was about $25 billion. And it took a lot of resources away from what should have been a rapid reindustrialization and a redistribution of wealth and land and all the rest of it. So we're, I think, a series of great examples from the struggle here, but also some examples we need to learn from that are very regrettable. And we hope that the Palestinians, for example, as they gain more support for BDS, that they won't succumb to the same neoliberal post-colonial tendencies.
So there was a lot of things that you just unpacked there, but I cannot resist to ask a more or less personal question because you're the first person to my knowledge that knew Nelson Mandela personally. So again, personal curiosity, how was he
Well, in
away
the
from television cameras?
yeah, in the few meetings in an office where we had a minister, very, very dynamic minister, Jay Naidu, who was really managing it. And unfortunately, another top figure named Thabo Mbeki was the de facto prime minister in the Mandela government. And Mandela had a rather conservative streak. He had been a sort of ethnic leader back in his Xhosa family in the Transkei. Now, what that meant was that he often would gather his chosen elites around him and make decisions in a collective way. But it didn't mean, unfortunately, that the progressive forces within the struggle often dominated. So, aside from winning the one person, one vote, a basic liberal victory against the forces of white reaction and business who didn't want to see blacks have democracy, aside from that huge victory, no one can ever deny, there are accusations that Mandela made way too many concessions and that he looked up to, let's say, leaders of world business, banking, uh, people like Bill Clinton, whom he was around a great deal, and then was basically too supplicant when it came to the genuine liberation of the society and redistribution of land, managing some of the, let's say, housing and urban problems and reorienting the economy. And unfortunately, this was a period, you remember, in the 90s with a collapse of the Soviet Union, which meant you sort of had to obey Western dictates. And that was the so-called Washington Consensus, in which privatization and high interest rates, liberalization of exchange controls, the, let's say, regular deregulation of many parts of the economy. These were all the sort of dictates. And I've written a couple of million words, published many books and articles about this process. And it really did mean this is why, because Mandela was too weak on basic socioeconomic justice and environment, that we have a society today that's more unequal, has worse unemployment, much higher levels of poverty, worse environmental degradation, and even more tense gender relations with more gender based violence than we did even during apartheid. And I would attribute that to Mandela's compromises, which I don't think, having worked in those offices, having worked with the mass movements, I don't think they were necessary.
Hmm. You just scratched on it. You wrote a couple of books. You are modest. I have your website open here. You wrote at least, and correct me if I'm wrong, at least I think 20 books. I stopped counting at 20. You have a massive amount of scholarly book chapters and so actual scientific research papers. So you're a prolific writer, and I probably I should have said this at the very beginning. You're a professor at the university in Johannesburg. Now,
Well,
yeah,
maybe
please.
I'll just quickly say that when one does research support work in a movement setting, you get many agendas that are uh, requested and that open up, and really the collective character of the work, co-edited books or jointly authored work, must be stressed, and particularly because we have an approach here, Thomas, that is, let's call it a praxis epistemology without using my jargon from academia, just means that knowledge gets produced often in social struggles, and particularly where there are sites where our armchair academic people, I mean, myself included, we miss the potential breakthrough in power because often we're too scared. We're not going to go to the site of the protest or the riot or the strike, the demonstration. And as a result, we often are asking our best students who are activists to tell us, and we get PhDs and master's theses from activists who are able to look. They don't just see and hear and feel the heat of the conflict, but they're there as strategists to break through and shed light on how power relations can be changed. I mean, I've made mistakes in this country that I'm embarrassed about, like not taking seriously enough the potential for a breakthrough on the biggest struggle for many people, about 7 million people here who are living with HIV, and the struggle led by the Treatment Action Campaign. When I did my power analysis and looked at the prevailing balance of forces, I suggested, and I've written this, I'm very embarrassed, that we would lose. We would lose that struggle against big pharma corps from the West, and Bill Gates with his intellectual property fetish, and US government, and the South African government with an AIDS denialist. Well, thank goodness I was wrong, because I wasn't paying enough attention to the struggle and seeing the potential for the light to come through and shed, let's say, more insights on how you can change power. And because power was changed, and the AIDS medicines, which cost about $10,000 per year, then became free for 7 million people living with HIV. Our life expectancy here went from 52 at the bottom of the trough in 2004 to 65 just before COVID. And, that's an extraordinary victory. I think it's probably, after getting rid of apartheid, what South Africans can say the world must learn from, that is to decommodify some basic global public goods. COVID-19 vaccines were our next effort. We failed. It was therefore vaccine apartheid. But also to de-globalize, to produce medicines generically here in South Africa, and to do so in a decommodified way so that everyone can get them for free. The poorest people, or petty bourgeois or bourgeois, can all get these medicines, the AIDS medicines. And that's the, let's say, greatest advance I think we've had in social theory activism and also theorization. How do you break big global power relations like intellectual property and the trade-related intellectual property system of the World Trade Organization with allies like Médecins Sans Frontières, Oxfam, or especially in the US, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. So we really picked up all of those. And if our AIDS activists had not had the support of very advanced trade unionists in the Congress of South African Trade Unions, as well as a broad array of other radical social movements, we probably would still be looking at a life expectancy that's very low and terrible agony and tragedy associated with AIDS. Now it's a manageable disease like diabetes.
Hmm. Patrick, I would, and we really can consider this. I would be really interested to hear more about South Africa, the Western relationship, imperialism, colonialism in regards to South Africa. But in this specific interview, I was hoping we could look at the Israel-Palestine situation, but through the lens from someone with your background coming from Belfast and living now in South Africa, because I think that's quite a unique angle. And whilst you were speaking, I had a thought that I had not presented in my outline. So I do not know if you can talk about it. But Israel supported South Africa the apartheid regime of South Africa till the very last minute. And Nelson Mandela said himself he will never forget the support Israel gave to pause the South African apartheid regime. Yeah, that's coming from himself. But specifically, there is a very dark chapter, and most people are not really aware that South Africa actually had a nuclear program, and they had a nuclear program thanks to Israel. And South Africa delivered massive amounts of yellow cake, hundreds of tons, to Israel's still today secret nuclear program. Is that a topic that you can comment on?
Yes, that's exactly right. And we can go back to a very strange contradiction, because South Africa is full of dialectics, lots of these contradictions. And that was that the government of the day, and indeed the leader at the time, Forster, was formerly a Nazi. The quasi-Nazi movement in South Africa in the 1940s that supported Germany in World War II, then in 1948 became the core power in the National Party. And they left power in 1994. But from 1948 until then, you had these sort of former Nazi sympathizers in Pretoria, the capital of South Africa. And by the 70s, they'd begun to figure out, well, if the African National Congress in exile was meeting up with groups like the Irish Republican Army and the Palestine Liberation Organization and other forces of liberation all around the world, and especially the PLO and the ANC were getting together in places like Libya and Lebanon to train, as well as meeting in places like the Soviet Union. They were given support from all sorts of sites in that period. Then what the white South Africans decided was, in alliance with, of course, the US, where there was a very strong white South African sub-imperial relationship with Washington, well, Washington could easily help put together its other big sub-imperial force, Israel. And they did work on nuclear technologies. And South Africa in 1979 did actually test an atomic bomb. And there's been quite a bit written about the Israeli inputs into that. And then the decommissioning of the atomic bomb in our nuclear weapons capacity in 1992 occurred because there was the writing on the wall. The president at that time, de Klerk, did agree, well, we'll get rid of our nuclear weapons. They're the only country to do so. And the fear was that, well, maybe Nelson Mandela is still very friendly with Gaddafi, with Fidel Castro, with all sorts of people that the US just didn't want. So I would always look at our past in this country as having not only the white racism that drove forward the mode of production and its, the race class relations that were so profitable, but also the sub-imperialism, which meant fealty to Washington, no matter who was in charge, even Jimmy Carter at one point, at the same time as being allied with Israel. And that white racist relationship also has, of course, a lot to do with the way systems like surveillance and economic relations. One major difference with Israel and South Africa that emerged, especially after the Soviet Union collapsed, with the huge influx, even Vladimir Putin has estimated 2 million Russian speakers of about 7.2 million Jewish residents of Israel, having moved in the 1990s, there was a much less, let's say, intense need, as we had in South Africa and prior in Israel, for black labor. And black labor in South Africa was the most exploited in the world because of the capacities to have a Bantustan, a homeland, a distant migrant labor relationship where you'd sort of take men for 10, 11 months of the year, and then they would go back for a month or so, December. But in the meantime, the reproduction of that labor, raising a child without any real state schools or creches, the preschool, and then when a worker was sick, trying to repair their broken limbs or get them back to health, and then when the worker was old and retired, going back to that reserve. That was women's work, and that women's work is unpaid, is even more intense than the unpaid women's labor that we have under normal urban capitalism, because this was a capitalism that had no support from the state, no medical aid system from companies, no retirement pot, just maybe a little plastic watch, perhaps, if you were a good worker. And in those conditions, women's social reproduction, that is the subsidy that big business would take from the woman to make the workers super cheap, that was to some extent reproduced in the Israeli hiring of Palestinians. But then came this large influx of Russians, and there were other immigrants, and it was at some point basically decided, with a few exceptions and maybe a few industries that were in the illegal settlements of the occupied West Bank or along the borderlines, that Palestinian labor within Israel should be avoided. And that is a major difference, of course, because it was the trade unions, the strikes, the labor militancy, and it was combinations of labor and community and church and student activism that overthrew the apartheid regime with this international help. So when we talk about a BDS, Thomas, a boycott, divestment, sanctions, the ease of doing so from South Africa with a very robust protest movement, from the revival of protests in the Durban docks of workers, the students in 1976 in Soweto, the community movements in the Eastern Cape, city called Gqeberha, and then here in the Johannesburg area, it all began to come together in the mid-80s, and that's when a financial crash that was partly provoked by our sanctions activism against banks occurred. Would that be potentially repeated? The person I turn to most, Omar Barghouti, in the Boycott National Committee in Palestine, would tell us with some confidence that indeed we are using from Palestine, starting in 2005, this South African model. And the crucial part is the delegitimization of the state of Israel as a rogue regime, just the way we've said, well, the white South African regime here in South Africa was rogue. It wasn't a democracy, it was a racist regime, and it had to be dismantled. And we needed to give every form of support, including and especially sanctions, to weaken the economic basis, and therefore to change the power relations and drive a wedge between white businesses on the one side and the white political regime. And that's in a way still a logic of our nonviolent theory of change. Obviously, there are liberation forces in Palestine. People will support what Hamas is doing, or look at the Houthis as strong allies and think of Iran. But I would say that the nonviolent addition that might ultimately be as effective as it was here would be sanctions. And then the next question, well, where are the vulnerabilities? And some of them, like the activists like Omar Barghouti, or certainly Shir Havir, an Israeli who's a very, very powerful thinker and expert about the Israeli economy, and he lives in exile in Germany, and he'll always report on the different ways we can take weapons out of Israel's hands, or the specific area that we work on together, how to get rid of the energy.
Can you repeat his name? I didn't really
Yes,
catch his name.
Shir Havir, Shir, and then his surname Hever. And I'll put you in touch with him. I'm sure if you visit Germany, or you can get him online, he'll be a very, very good ally. So what we get from BDS, let's say in the core Ramallah and the sort of circuits where the Palestinians are talking about what is their strategy, what is their theory of change, we'll see an energy embargo. And the embarrassment, I must tell you, Thomas, is that the number one exporter of coal in recent years is Colombia, but South Africa has been number two. Russia is often number two, but South Africa is either second or third. Currently, we're running second. Just last month, another 170,000 tons of coal came from South Africa to Hadera, the Israeli shoreline, which feeds the Orat Rabin power plant, and that plus the Rutenburg power plant give the Israelis 17.5% of the electricity in their grid. There's, of course, a climate angle, so we have very powerful climate activists here in South Africa who are joining us at the protest sites, where we're often saying to companies like Glencore or African Rainbow Minerals, companies like Tungela, former Anglo Coal, stop all coal exports to Israel. And we've been saying that to the government. And the irony, I must tell you, Thomas, it's the irony and the embarrassment, is that the president is a coal mining tycoon. His former company was by and large a coal company, Shanduka Coal. He had many other interests as well, including platinum. He was in the Maracana massacre incident as a result. And his brother-in-law, Patrice Motsepe, is the owner of African Rainbow Minerals, which is the main alliance with Glencore. But Ramaphosa, our president, Cyril Ramaphosa, himself, was in alliance with Glencore. Now, why is Glencore interesting? It worked in the DRC for many years with the main Israeli tycoon there who sort of loots the area. But most importantly, Glencore has been bribing African governments, including, I would argue, this one. We haven't seen prosecutions. And the fines actually forced a Johannesburg-born CEO, Ivan Glassenberg, out. And he'd been on the Israeli fast walking sort of Olympic team in the 80s. And he connected all of these, let's say, relationships. And so has his successor, Gary Nagel, and one of the board members, Jill Marcus. And they were confronted at the Swiss annual general meeting last May and basically shrugged and said, yeah, we bring coal to Israel. So we're really looking at how to disempower at least the 17.5%. We love the Nigerians and the Brazilians, the Kazakhs and the Azerbaijanis, all of those who provide oil. We'd love the UAE and Saudi Arabia to stop the gas relationships. We'd love all of these, let's say, energy boycott factors to come together. And in Amsterdam, there's a group, SOMO, which has done a report in December 2024 to specify where oil and gas should be stopped. The countries I've mentioned, with maybe one exception, Azerbaijan, they're all now part of the BRICS. They're either formal members like Brazil, like Russia, even China exports coal to Israel, and of course South Africa, or they are aspiring BRICS. They are partners of BRICS. And it's a shocking reflection on the hypocrisy of BRICS, which talks anti-imperialist, but certainly when it makes profits from Israel. I mean, the Chinese drones, one that killed Yahya Sinwar, or the $20 billion in trade between China and Israel, or the management of two ports at Haifa and Ashdod by the Chinese. One could go on, the Indians with military relationships, the Russians with those 2 million, according to Putin, 2 million Russian speakers who serve in the IDF. Some of them were taken hostage. For South Africa, the irony is we even have an arms dealer operating out of Johannesburg who was the main funder of the African National Congress just 2 years ago, before the October 7 breakout of Hamas and Gazans. And at that point, that man, his name's Ivor Chikowitz, turned around and then began to write very angry articles in major international magazines and newspapers against his comrades, right, from the African National Congress. But he's Africa's main private arms dealer, and he has a Tel Aviv office, and he sets up all sorts of very strange relationships, providing tefillin, which is a sort of spiritual leather garb where you wrap leather around your wrist and you have some on your head with a verse from the Torah. And all of these things mean, I think, Thomas, we've not done as good a job in fighting these sub-imperial BRICS relationships to Israel as we do with, obviously, very, very good sustained protests, as much as can be done, even where there's extreme oppression in fascistic governments, like now the United States, certainly like Germany's, against those who want to speak up for Palestine.
Amazing. Whilst you're speaking, I try to process at least some of it. It's amazing the depth and breadth of information that you're producing.
Well,
I
it's really
noted a
from
couple of
on.
things.
Yeah, Thomas, I must say, there's a movement here, a movement of BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, that closely correlates to our allies in the climate justice movement. And we are looking for health workers, for example, who do activism to promote the health of Palestinians or to criticize Israeli health connections to South African companies. So we've got a good movement here, but it needs to be stronger, of course. We need to put enough
Hmm.
pressure so that the government's hypocrisy, when it can go to The Hague and have an international court of justice trial early 2024, calling out Israel for genocide, or it can go to the International Criminal Court and support arrest warrants against Netanyahu, or as we saw on January 31 this year, very important development, perhaps you saw it as well, Thomas, the Hague Group, that was South Africa and 7 other countries, Malaysia, Colombia, Bolivia, Cuba, Namibia. We had some countries that said, we will defend the International Criminal Court against the United States, which wants to put on sanctions and try to make it very difficult for the ICC's personnel. To me, that's one of the opportunities when you see Donald Trump in action. You either succumb, which unfortunately South African leaders are doing on many fronts, or secondly, you stand up alone and you might get punched back down. But thirdly, you have the chance to have more unity. And with the G20 this year, Thomas, here you had the G20 in I suppose the closest location to you would have been Hamburg in 2017. I happened to be there with the activists, and those experiences suggest maybe this time around we can actually split Donald Trump away from the rest of this G20 bloc. It won't happen on the issue of Israeli liberation because, as I say, there's an axis of genocide that goes from Washington and, of course, Ottawa and London down to Brussels and over to Berlin, Paris, Tokyo, all of these axis of genocide powers. But regrettably, in the axis of genocide now we find BRICS countries as well, notwithstanding the supposed potential alternative or anti-imperial rhetoric you get and the desire for peace and justice that you hear from the BRICS countries. Well, they're making a lot of money from the genocide.
Axis of genocide. Wow. That aligns with what you said before with the sanctions. So in the case of South Africa, the sanctions came all from other nations. Now in the case of Israel, let's just say, and I had similar discussions with other speakers. So it doesn't look at the moment that there will be sanctions against Israel, at least not from the Western alliance, so to speak. Right? They're all supporting Israel for geostrategic reasons, I mean, there is the statement, I think, from Joe Biden from the 1980s already. If we wouldn't have Israel, then we would need to invent it, or Israel is the unsinkable supercarrier. I saw some headlines yesterday. Is the unsinkable supercarrier sinking? I think there was a headline from yesterday, right? So,
well, if I can just add to your metaphor, the metaphor of an airline carrier, right? An aircraft carrier, a major part of a navy. And even Robert F. Kennedy Jr., RFK Jr., who's now the health minister in the US and with all his controversies, he even said, notwithstanding a generally anti-war, anti-imperial position that he carried, but he said, yeah, we desperately need Israel because it's our aircraft carrier in the Middle East. And without that, how are we going to make sure that we have access to all that oil and gas in the Middle East? So, in a sense, the feeling of US imperialists, even the more, let's say, sort of anti-war versions like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., is that Israel is indispensable to the fossil fuel economy. Someone, like Adam Hania, who's a great Palestinian Australian, now teaching in Exeter in the UK. He'll write, as he does in his books on the Gulf Cooperation Council, about these terribly tight links that relate to energy between Washington on the one hand, Riyadh and Abu Dhabi on the other hand, and Israel on another hand, which is these imperial and military, but especially for the United States, the addiction to fossil fuels. Now, even though the US has changed because methane gas was found during Barack Obama's regime in a very, very prolific way, they obviously sort of moved away from being a major importer to having export capacities in fossil fuels in the early 2010s. Even so, there is such a determination, and it might be simply because Donald Trump is such an Israeli-phile. In other words, he's so close. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, it's very, very tight with the Netanyahu's going back decades. But then you see what Trump proposed for Gaza, which is that it will be the Riviera of the Middle East, and then there'll be Trump hotels, and you some sort of send around a video clip where there were no Palestinians left. 2 million people displaced, ethnically cleansed. And that was on February 4. And it's in that sense that I'm saying, Thomas, we really have to come to grips with Trump as a major figure in the world that must be opposed in a unified way. And unfortunately, just to give you a sense of how hard this is, on February 5, just after this statement by Trump with Netanyahu there to ethnically cleanse Gaza and get rid of all the people, just after that, Cyril Ramaphosa's main spokesperson said, yeah, we're still trying to arrange a game of golf with Donald Trump, and we've got to take our president off, give him some spare time so he can improve his swing and have a decent game. Literally those words. And that's the sort of obsequiousness. It's gotten worse in the last few days because Cyril Ramaphosa, who can stand up very firmly when he wants to on behalf of his foreign minister, the former foreign minister, Naledi Pandor especially, to support the case against Israel in the International Court of Justice. But now he's trying to attract Donald Trump by offering him offshore gas and oil exploration rights for the likes of ExxonMobil and for Chevron and those sorts of companies. And to me, that's one of the most shocking new developments, where the transactional character that Cyril Ramaphosa recognizes is now being played in a way that will make everything worse. A relationship with Trump that tightens, a G20 that legitimizes the imperialist and sub-imperialist liaison that is on every front, including climate change, the most difficult, the most important, because Trump has withdrawn from the UNFCCC and is going full steam ahead with every fossil fuel project he can find.
Trump Gaza, the relationship with his son-in-law Jared Kushner, who openly discussed the beachfront property in Gaza. I interviewed Rich Siegel, who investigated Israeli companies selling also selling land from the occupied territories in American synagogues. Miriam Adelson, the widow of casino baron Sheldon Adelson, financed Trump with hundreds of millions of dollars. It was actually her husband who is responsible that the Israeli embassy has been moved. It's just absolutely stunning that the transactional way of doing business under the first and now second Trump administration, which brings me back to what you said, the sanctions. So where on earth should equal to South Africa, where should these sanctions come from when the Western world is united in not sanctioning Israel, and the rest of the world, which is actually the majority of the world, is too fragmented? So where are those sanctions supposed to come from?
Oh, well, Thomas, it's true that the fragmentation reflects that there are elites in various countries, South Africa, for example, which don't want to do sanctions, partly because, as I said, our president's brother-in-law, Patrice Motsepe, and his former company, Allied, Glencore, very, very corrupt company, they were the ones making lots of money. So it's these elites who are doing the trading. I would assume if I went to Beijing and I said, hey, why are you sending drones to the IDF? Why is there $20 billion of trade? Why have you privatized the Hedera and Ashdod ports and continue to allow all the military equipment to go through there? And they'd say, well, it's our Communist Party where we have lots of billionaires. So, it's a problem of our ruling elites everywhere. So then the answer isn't really to expect states, but to instead figure out people-to-people solidarity. And that's, of course, how South Africa's banking sanctions in 1985 were effectively, during Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher or Helmut Kohl, were effectively imposed on the banks by popular protests, the mass of people and students and churches saying we're divest. Is that happening with Israel? Before I, think about ways we can really intervene and cause Israel damage using this nonviolent BDS approach, just think of one man who's sparked a BDS. That is Elon Musk. He was born not far from here. He went to high school here in Johannesburg. He was very badly bullied, kicked down a couple of flights of stairs, spent 2 weeks in hospital. He might have been a very nice little boy. But then what they do to train you in this city, if you're a white boy, you have to run the apartheid system or the corrupt corporations. This is the number one city for corruption in corporate affairs, according to PwC, a very corrupt company, so I trust them. And if you look at that sort of relationship where a little boy, Elon Musk, is trained here in Johannesburg during apartheid, along with a few others like Peter Thiel or David Sachs, or, there's all sorts of characters from South Africa who show up.
Peter Thiel is from South Africa.
Yeah. Peter Thiel did a couple of years study at one of the schools and was also from Namibia. He's a German-born, as I understand, and was, in Swakopmund in the Southwest Africa in the sort of period of Namibia's colonization by white South Africa. And in all those respects, you kind of say, well, what can be done against characters like Elon Musk, the richest man in the world? Well, as of about a month or so ago, 6 weeks ago, he had about $400 and something billion. Now he's down $100 billion. And his company, which was Tesla, the main one, worth 1.3 trillion, is down around to 700 billion today. I have to check the latest. What's going on? Well, partly Wall Street is just nailing him, right? But it's also, you can see it in the protests that are going on last week and this week. Now, Donald Trump desperately trying to help his friend Elon Musk by
Selling
advertising these great
Teslas.
cars and trucks.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Tesla, I think. Donald Trump's always a little off with his pronunciations. And so that to me reflects, Thomas, that we can do a people's sanctions, a people's bottom up set of protests and boycott, divestment, sanctions, and make Elon Musk as disreputable and as unprofitable as we should be making the state of Israel and the companies that do business with it. And there are some companies that, Intel pulled out a $25 billion chip manufacturing plant in Israel. Many banks are under pressure not to fund. There's a company called Elbit, Israel's main military industrial complex company. They get their overseas plants invaded by protesters. The companies like McDonald's and Coca-Cola that are in Israel, or McDonald's or Kentucky Fried Chicken, being boycotted, especially in the Muslim consumer networks. Very, very strong boycotts that have really, in Turkey, I think I've just seen where some of these big U.S. companies, because of the connection to Israel, have now more or less their branches gone bankrupt. These are little indicators that if we can break through the sort of media blackout of what we do in BDS and really show that fighting from below can have an impact. I can testify that we certainly did so here in South Africa during the mid-'80s, as protests from below inspired international concern and solidarity. You can get a BDS to really change those power relations.
There is one sector that is massively earning money from for Israel, of course, and that's the military-industrial complex, especially with their so-called battle-tested, and it's not only hardware, it's more and more the, let's say, software, artificial intelligence, facial recognitions, automated, that Amnesty International report called automated apartheid, I think, encapsulates it well. Now Israel is selling, I have not the exact numbers now, but Israel is a main exporter, I think, for India. India is I think the biggest market for Israel. There are a number of other countries, right? The problem with that is that when you shift away from military hardware to military software and applications and artificial intelligence, there remains a dependency on Israel for updates, for renewals, for whatever. Yeah, and these countries that purchase these kind of products. One in the news frequently is, of course, Pegasus, the spyware, which can hack any phone without you doing anything at all. These kind of products make client countries of Israel dependent on Israel. So there is a how shall I say this, a contradiction. Yeah. So on let's say grassroots levels, we talk about BDS, whilst the governments pour billions, also virtually billions of US dollars into Israel, and by doing so, of course, supporting this automated apartheid. Not only that, but they also import it into their own countries, because that's what we are seeing worldwide through the populism, the rise of almost fascism, yeah, and then of course the population control, yeah, that's coming hand in hand, and using Israeli battle-tested in Gaza, yeah, battle-tested technology.
Yes, everything you're saying is terribly important, and we see some, very important journalistic and other, sort of researchers unveiling this. On the other hand, we shouldn't be too intimidated. I mean, after all, the Hamas breakout in October of 2023 reflected that there are major gaps in not only the surveillance, but in their automated defense systems, their abilities to stop liberation movement. Now, the main dilemma, one doesn't want to support armed struggle if it's not necessary. Many would say it is necessary. The dilemma, though, is that all over the world, as you say, the tools of surveillance, the tools of intervention and hacking are powerful. Here in South Africa, we even have this same Ivor Ichikowitz I mentioned as the main arms dealer, offering the so-called kamikaze drones. And Gazans know these drones well, not these particular ones, but ones China makes or made in the US. And those drones hover above, let's say, a Gaza block of flats and wait until the particular marked person identified through perhaps a very flawed AI system is coming out, and then wait up there. And they're called loitering munitions. They loiter around and then they wait until there's time, and then they can just go and kill, on demand. And so this is part of the rhetoric. And even in a city like Johannesburg, where we, since the mid 1990s, have been deconstructing the military, really the early 90s. We basically have a very dysfunctional military that today we learned is being pulled out of the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, had to be pulled out of Mozambique. It's not a very functioning sub-imperial military. But even here in Johannesburg, our private sector is moving in that direction, hand in glove with in this case, Elbit, the company Paramount, that works with Elbit to supply the Ecuadorians, a fascistic army that is waging war on its people, gets military vehicles from South Africa that are souped up with communications and surveillance systems by Elbit from Israel, and then they sort of, do patrolling in Ecuador, and again part of a sort of low-grade warfare on those who oppose extractivism in those sorts of parts of the world. And I think those really do bring together. We certainly work with our Ecuadorian compañeros and compañeros, and we sort of find ways to raise these questions, and defense mechanisms in the case of Ecuador, a brilliant strategy to try to leave fossil fuels there underground and to have an international campaign. So I think every time we see, let's say, the forces of reaction and of predatory capitalism, the extractive industries as they advance on us, well, we are getting our networks together. I must say, though, Thomas, the hardest would be the BRICS. And that's for two reasons. One is in two of the countries in the core BRICS, that is in China and Russia, there is a serious problem with our finding solidarity. One of our dearest allies in Russia, Boris Kagarlitsky, a great sociologist, has been in jail a couple of years, and he has 3 more to go. His crime was telling a joke about a cat when the Ukrainians blew up the bridge between Crimea and the mainland. He's a brilliant, brilliant sociologist who's stuck in jail. Luckily, we still get his writings, and at links.org.au you'll find Kagarlitsky. China's more difficult, where our comrades who were in Hong Kong have had to go into exile. Many of the other progressive movements really have to keep their heads down. And therefore, when I say that there are major problems with China giving drones to the IDF, China doing $20 billion of trade with Israel, China privatizing the Haifa and Ashdod ports, and we don't really have a way to generate the sort of solidarity we need in China to put pressure on the regime to stop these Chinese capitalists, or in some cases even state-owned companies, from doing business with the genocidaires. It's a general problem as well because the BRICS do have a reputation, which I think is entirely undeserved. The reputation, Thomas, is of the anti-imperial, the attempts to set up alternative institutions to Western-dominated, the attempt to de-dollarize. And when I look in detail, and I've written, a few books and lots of articles and chapters about what the BRICS are actually up to, it's not anti-imperial. It's still in that model of being within Western capitalist sub-imperialism. My telephone has some child labor. I can see their fingerprints, the poor kids from the DRC, in Chinese mines. And they're rooted out of Eastern DRC illegally through Rwanda. They go to the east coast of China, where Foxconn companies will, sort of the huge plants exploit the workers so alienated that there was a spate of suicides. And then finally, they go to Cupertino, California, where the Apple company puts on its branding and the software and puts on some financing and distribution and marketing, and they do this sort of intellectual property management. And that's where, of course, all the profits go in this global value chain. And unfortunately, that's where we see BRICS as sub-imperial within, not anti-imperial against. And that means it's actually for part of the world's left. If we have 2 big lefts, one believes that Putin is anti-imperialist and was under pressure from NATO and therefore justified in invading Ukraine, that China is socialist, that BRICS are anti-imperialist on the one hand, and that's the dominant thinking here among our major left leaders in the major organizations. And then you have an independent left that's more committed to social movements, social struggles, environment, concerns about sovereignty. And that other part of the world left looks at South Africa, and like I do, we get very confused. There's lots of mixed messages here.
If you stay a little bit on BRICS, because I saw that you have written extensively. So for me, BRICS, and I have not looked as deep as you did, of course, yeah. But for me, and correct me if I'm wrong, for me, one of the main items is in relation to BRICS is the de-dollarization, because we, the West, or specifically the US, have weaponized money, have weaponized assets even. So they kicked Russia out of SWIFT. They are discussing. So what's the story here? So there's $300 billion of assets. Russian assets are frozen, and I mean, Zelensky would love to have them, and there are discussions in Europe and in the US of providing those Russian assets to Ukraine, or at least the interest, these kind of things. That's of course a warning sign for other countries like China. China, who of course is the largest the largest owner of American debt. I mean, how crazy is this? America was able to sell their debt. I mean, this is a system that's upside down. So in terms of BRICS, is the de-dollarization as high on their agenda as it may seem from the outside?
Thomas, I would love to say yes. I would love to be able to say that Donald Trump is correct, that this is a big threat, and that the BRICS, which he says includes Spain and does not include China, so you know he's not really paying attention. Neither is true. But unfortunately, the evidence suggests that the BRICS are too frightened, but also their elites are too westward gazing. Let me even add, before I explain, Thomas, that there's an even greater reason to de-dollarize. It's not just the weaponization or the theft that Janet Yellen, the US finance minister, arranged in 2022, and the boycotting of SWIFT, all of the things that you mentioned. I would add that the BRICS New Development Bank went 100% with the boycott, even though 20% of the ownership of the BRICS New Development Bank resides in Moscow. But they still put BRICS put Russia on the sanctions list and advertised it regularly when they were out raising funds in the West. But there's a bigger reason, isn't there, to oppose the US dollar? 2 years I spent working in the Federal Reserve, the most oppressive economic institution in history, the US Federal Reserve. And the subsequent, when I was there, a guy called Paul Volcker put the interest rates up so high. It was a third world debt crisis that killed tens of millions. But then we've seen something, especially bailouts in 1998, Citibank, the savings and loans, 1998 with long-term capital management, bailouts that affected the banks that were exposed in the middle-income countries that were defaulting in the late 90s. But especially, do you remember 2008, Thomas, when they started something brand new, quantitative easing? They simply printed money. It was dollars, but it was also British pounds and euros, Japanese yen. And the reason we have a G20 was because the world financial meltdown was serious. It crashes by March 2009 were as serious as they were in 1929. So a terrible meltdown that required a huge set of bailouts. The real need for de-dollarization, very few of the BRICS elites would acknowledge or would even have any sort of genuine support for, and that is that the US dollar is excessively, let's say, a US sovereign power through printing on the one hand and raising interest rates on the other. And the printing presses, called quantitative easing, simply easing the quantitative amount of dollars in the system, printing money. That was experienced with the US dollar as well as the British pound and the euro and the Japanese yen in 2008 as the world financial crisis deepened. In 2009, the G20 approved that and also gave $1 trillion to the IMF. And what we found then, Thomas, was that the ability to bail out Western banks, first and foremost, also increased financial asset prices and therefore contributed to the 2010s extreme inequality. And second, then when they began to pull back, particularly if you remember the second time they used this was in COVID, big lockdowns required big financial, fiscal, and monetary stimulus. But when they ended that for Jerome Powell, the US Federal Reserve chair, what he did was raise interest rates from early 2022. Hey, that had a devastating impact all around the world. Here in Africa, even three of the main economies of the 2010s that had been considered success stories, Ghana, with its gold and its cocoa outputs, its coal, its oil. Secondly, Zambia with its copper. And thirdly, Ethiopia, which had become a sweatshop site for manufacturing. Those three economies that had done very well were hit with the high interest rates on their euro and dollar denominated loans, and then they went into default. Even Ethiopia, which is now a full member of BRICS, one of 10, they couldn't join the BRICS New Development Bank because they're technically a debtor in default. These are the sorts of problems, let's say, that are much bigger than whether there's a better system of ruble rupee trade. That ruble Russian and rupee Indian trade was very important. So that Vladimir Putin could sell lots of excess energy. He wasn't selling it to Europe, so he could reroute it to India. However, there was so much $57 billion extra that the Russians could sell the Indians, and the Indians didn't have much to sell back. That this trade deficit meant that the financial relations, which you'd want to have, which is country to country trade, more or less barter trade, broke down because of the extraordinary imbalances. And that means you really do need a BRICS currency. And the only one that would really do is the yuan. But the Indians won't use the yuan because they have such tensions between China and India. And the yuan is actually the renminbi, the Chinese currency, very, very useful for Beijing to control their own capitalist class with exchange controls or to prevent cyber currencies from emerging. So in all these ways, I wish the BRICS would do something on de-dollarization. My expectation is they won't do anything. And when I talk to people in Johannesburg or Sao Paulo or Mumbai or Shanghai, uh, those four big Western gazing capitals of finance, the key elites that I meet and I talk to and I listen to there, they don't want to de-dollarize. They're perfectly happy with the existing system where they can rely on the dollar, no matter how abusive the managers in the Federal Reserve are. Quantitative easing one day, high interest rates the next. And I really think we need to break through that, but it probably won't be from the BRICS.
But there's another element to this, and that's the petrodollar. So very briefly, the petrodollar, I mean, I know that you know, but most people that I talk to, they don't understand the concept of the petrodollar, which means basically that anyone who buys oil first need to give America actual assets, gold, silver, whatever, which is then transformed into worthless paper. And you can then use this worthless paper to buy oil. Now, coincidence or not, both Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi shared one thing in common. They sold oil against something else than the US dollar. Both are being dead today. Now, two other countries who are doing this, Russia and Iran, are also on the list of being, on the axis of evil. So we see now China, of course, is also buying oil against something else than the US dollar. So is that another, how shall I say this? It's not it's it is related to de-dollarization, but it's a different flavor. So how far could that go? And I mean, again, I make it very black and white consciously. So without a petrodollar, my argument is without petrodollar, we will not have any American supercarriers either on land like in Israel or on the sea. We have now 11 floating around. Or is that too black and white?
Yeah, yes, oil is a central commodity, no dispute. And there are some other encouraging signs, like the yuan uh, dollar, that is a renminbi, instead of a US dollar, because China is a much bigger purchaser of Saudi Arabian oil. So in early 2023, when that deal unfolded, it was seen as a major step forward. And an extra addition to that is that the Chinese felt so confident with their huge dollar reserves that they made a loan to the Saudis in dollars. Well, that seemed to, again, strengthen dollar hegemony. But all of these suggest there could be some cracks in the system. But I don't think yet we're at the point where, first of all, Saudi Arabia, which joined the BRICS, or said they would, and then they actually didn't come to any meetings in 2024. Their elites just stayed away. A few of the minor functionaries came, and they never joined, and their application was so-called frozen by the Russians in late 2024. I mean, they were obviously waiting to see if Biden, Kamala Harris, or Donald Trump would win. And when Trump won, they basically have walked away from joining the BRICS. We saw Argentina in 2023 being offered membership of the BRICS, walked away when Javier Milei, the right-wing candidate won. We've seen countries like Algeria or Vietnam or Turkey being offered partnerships. They even applied, but they're not yet accepting. So let's put it this way, Thomas, that to do what we'd like to see, that is an all-out replacement of the dollar through a general consensus, a Bretton Woods of the people of the South, that there would be a better way to arrange things. We're counting, unfortunately, on elites in BRICS countries who really are very unreliable, the Saudis certainly, but also who have special interests, like China, in retaining the power of the dollar. So even though they are disinvesting a little bit from the US Treasury bills, they're buying more US corporate securities. So their dollar holdings haven't really changed. And I regret to say, I hate to say this, but if you look at the SWIFT system, sure, Russia's not in it, that wasn't a very big part, but the euro is the one that's been really suffering in terms of the turnover. And the dollar has actually increased from about 42% to more than 60% of transactions in the SWIFT system. So we're not seeing a de-dollarization, we're seeing a re-dollarization. It breaks my heart because I've seen from the inside of the Federal Reserve when I worked there that that has to change.
I understand it, of course, from a Chinese perspective, because they own so much U.S. debt, U.S. bonds, they have no interest in eliminating the dollar. Yeah, but you just mentioned Saudi Arabia a couple of times. Now, Saudi Arabia, okay. During the Biden administration, Saudi Arabia, with this Khashoggi incident in Istanbul, yeah, became a kind of a pariah. And later, Biden kind of made a U-turn and went to Saudi Arabia and met the king, blah, blah, blah. Now we are seeing with the Trump administration, we are seeing suddenly Saudi Arabia engaged in both Israel, Palestine, and the Ukraine war. So what's going on here in Saudi Arabia?
Yes, well, the Saudis have got this schizophrenia, and it comes from having such an extreme elite. And they, of course, were also at one point the site where the bin Laden family, the construction tycoons, had a son who went out to first get supported, Osama bin Laden, by Donald Rumsfeld, the Pentagon chief, to fight when Ronald Reagan wanted to overthrow Russia and the Soviet Union. They did so in Afghanistan. And there, Osama bin Laden was the great ally of the CIA, set up with the Mujahideen there. But then, 2001, you saw the exact opposite. And I think that, let's call it a schizophrenia in Saudi society, especially where Mohammed bin Salman will pretend that he's reforming, but as you say, Kamal Khashoggi was literally chopped, and MBS has a new nickname after that, Mr. Bonesaw. And so when you see MBS come to South Africa, and he even has a game park about 4 or 5 hours north
Hmm.
by driving from here. The dilemma, of course, is that these Saudis are very unstable. And I think in relation to Israel, the Saudi elites, I mean, Mohammed bin Salman had to lock up all of his capitalists in a luxury hotel a few years ago to kind of get them on board his program, and threatens them and surveils them. But he understands that the street pressure is in solidarity with Palestine. And as much as he would like to normalize with Israel, and as much as he sees the likes of his major investor, Donald Trump's son-in-law, as the sort of vehicle to make that happen, there are going to be constraints. And while the Palestinians still can fight back, while you could say the weight of public opinion is shifting towards solidarity with Palestine, the terrible destruction, the genocide in Gaza, and the ongoing attacks on not only the West Bank, southern Lebanon, the uh, let's say
Syria.
occupation of more land in Syria. I think we're going to see more and more people around the world saying, "Yeah, Israel, you've gone way too far. You're a rogue regime, and we'll not." Be on board if the U.S. and Saudi Arabian Israeli elites get together. We'll consider you all rogues.
Hmm. Patrick, you were very generous with your time. But before we wrap this up, are there any topics, anything that's close to your heart that we did not discuss?
Well, I think we're worried here watching the G20 that the imperial and sub-imperial alliance will hold even at the most crucial juncture where we need it to break, and that is the climate catastrophe. So just a word or two. We've just had a seminar on the extent to which three conditions seem to hold for the G20 until Donald Trump came to power. Donald Trump's a climate denier, but his predecessors, the Biden regime and John Kerry especially, and his successor, John Podesta, managing climate politics. But this goes back to Barack Obama in 2009 in Copenhagen, where he barged in and he did a deal with Wen Jiabao from China and Manmohan Singh from India and Jacob Zuma from South Africa and Lula da Silva, the Brazilian president who's now back as president. Now, what the deal that links Imperial West, the G7, and the BRICS in the G20 is that they agree first, they do not want to cut emissions and leave fossil fuels underground to the extent necessary to save the planet. There's just no way under the prevailing balance of forces where the rest of the world insists on it, but the BRICS, the G7 combination, the G20 won't do it. Secondly, they will not admit that they emitted. They won't acknowledge liability or any climate debt. They won't pay any ecological reparations. And Donald Trump has just walked out of the very minimal reparation system, loss and damage, and some adaptation funding. The third is that they want to privatize the air. This is mostly the case in Europe, where they have a European Union emissions trading scheme. And they'll say, look, you can go and emit a ton. You have to pay, let's say, 80 euros. I think today is 75. Very, very volatile market. It was 110 euros a ton in February 2023. It crashed in half within a year. You let the bankers handle things like solving the climate, you're going to get a lot of gambling and speculation and volatility. Those three things, Thomas, mean what the rest of us outside are looking for. If we don't want a planetary catastrophe to get worse, it is already an extraordinary problem, especially in countries in Africa that had nothing to do with the climate crisis, but are paying some of the worst penalties. This week, another huge cyclone hitting Mozambique, for example, the worst affected country in Africa so far. And what I think we are going to need to do is really have a global climate justice movement, because the technicists, the people who would go with a kind of climate action approach, they're normally working within this UNFCCC, and it really is broken down. The last chance to save it will be in Brazil, and it'll be in December. So Brazil hosts the BRICS in July. We host the G20 here in Johannesburg in November, and the next month in December in Belém in the Amazon, Lula hosts the the COP30, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Conference of the Parties 30, so the 30th year. And the dilemma, of course, is Lula has got the best chance of any world leader, maybe short of Gustavo Petro in Colombia or Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico, to really stand up and take leadership for climate justice. And yet at the very same time, we're seeing him promote Petrobras, his oil company, state company from Brazil, in the Amazon, drilling for oil where the Amazon River hits the Atlantic Ocean, and even coming here to South Africa, working with Total Energies from Paris to drill for offshore oil and gas on our west coast. These are extraordinary contradictions. And of course, with Lula under such pressure from the Bolsonaro forces in his country, with Cyril Ramaphosa having a background as a coal mining tycoon, with Donald Trump walking out, with the Europeans relaxing more and more and not moving forward on their own carbon border adjustment mechanism. They've just made concessions here to South Africa recently. These are big, big problems for us all to engage, and we shouldn't have any illusions that we're going to see an anti-imperialist BRICS. As I said, when you look at the sort of power relations and the political economy of who's influencing these governments in these BRICS countries, because we're adding now the UAE, full member, catastrophe to have the UAE in anything, as well as Iran, another major fossil economy. Indonesia's just joined a couple of months ago, another huge coal exporter. Well, we're looking at a problem where society will have to get together much more forcefully and perhaps start with a BDS United States, and the easiest is a BDS Donald Trump, a BDS Elon Musk, to get off X.com, to not have any link to Starlink in the satellites. And of course, if you've got a Tesla, of course, we don't have any in South Africa. We have no electric cars really at all here. But if you have a Tesla, well, what people are doing is just driving them off the cliffs. There must be a better way, but I think we'll find it from civil society.
You said getoffx.com. Now I was involuntarily removed, so my account has been suspended as this Monday, as a couple of days ago. Yeah.
I suspect, Thomas, you said something sensible or something that was
I must have
solidaristic
done
with
something
Palestine.
right. I must, and
Yeah.
the flimsiest of reasons for authenticity violations. I mean, it's just crazy. Yeah.
Yeah.
But in regards to climate change, so I have the feeling, and to wrap this up, I sometimes think we as a global society, we are sitting on the Titanic after the Titanic has hit the iceberg, and we are all arguing about who can have the best seats in front of the orchestra, right? So completely not recognizing the gravity of the situation. And I mean, even the discussion, is it man-made, is it not man-made, is in my eyes futile in a basic sense, because we need to address the problem, right? And we need to have an agreement first to address the problem, and then we look at how we can, or what's the cause, right? So I think that's, I'm sitting here right now, 4.5 meters below sea level. A third of the Netherlands is 5 meters below sea level, right? So
Well, all I
it's
can say is
really
you're
can't.
climate proof for rising sea levels, unlike most South African cities. But I do think that when ordinary people follow some, let's say, logic of social change, and the one that we've been talking about is boycott, divestment, sanctions, it worked very well in South Africa. It's working a bit now in Israel, but it's also worked extremely well until Trump came to power with financiers of fossil fuels because of a divest invest approach. And 350.org, Bill McKibben, Naomi Klein, all sorts of wonderful people, Greta Thunberg pushing it, as well as the big forces of climate justice in the South say, yeah, you shouldn't invest in fossil fuels. And about $60 trillion at peak. It's much less with Trump coming to power, and then New York banks are now sort of retreating from that commitment. But that's $60 trillion that say to South African coal miners, no, we're not going to finance either a coal mine or a new coal-fired power plant. And even when Xi Jinping did that in 2021, you might remember in the United Nations, he said, no more coal-fired power plants on the Belt and Road. That was a wonderful, wonderful statement that helped us here in South Africa enormously with our own campaigning. So there are some possibilities, but I think we all have to get together on basic strategy and tactics. And that's, as I say, where I've tried to make arguments in spite of everyone who'd love there to be a BRICS fight back against Western imperialism. My dear friends, it's looking like a sub-imperial relationship, not anti-imperial.
So Patrick
Technically, yeah.
Bond, was my pleasure. See you next time.
I hope the next time Thomas will be with you and other comrades, either online with our weekly webinars from the University of Johannesburg called G20 from below, or let's see those who can make it to our city, Johannesburg, the most unequal in the world, with the most corporate criminality, according to PwC. We used to be the richest city in the world with half the world's historic gold, and we will be hosting the G20. But by then, we're going to be very, very much convinced it should be a G19 and there should be no Donald Trump, and the G20 next year shouldn't be in the US. We should find a way to find a global force of pressure from below against what's happening in the G20 or maybe the G19 if we're lucky.
Okay, thank you, Patrick Bond.